Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to our webinar, Weave Assessment 101. My name is Betsy Chandler, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sales here at Weave, and I have a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, and we'll send it out to you afterwards. We'll begin today's session with a couple of quick polls, and there's a question area on your GoToMeeting control panel, and we'll be moderating the questions after the presentation, but please feel free to pose them throughout the session. And finally, your feedback shapes what we do, so please complete the short survey after the session. Our presenter today is Amber Malinovsky, the Director of Content and Communications and an Assessment Specialist at Weave. If you've attended a webinar with us before, you already know Amber. She's been with Weave for almost 9 years. Prior to joining the team, she was an adjunct faculty member in English, a Writing Center Director, and the Assistant Director of Assessment at Texas A&M University. While there, she was responsible for implementing and managing Weave for the campus, which included training faculty and staff in over 400 programs. Amber creates all of the great content and resources that you can find on our website, weaveeducation.com, and is a key member of our team helping hundreds of institutions improve their assessment practices.
Thank you, Betsy. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited that you are giving up part of your Friday afternoon to spend with us today. Have a couple of other of our team members on here today. We had such a great response to this webinar. I wanted to include them. Jennifer Gray, our Director of Product Research, has also done this work at a SUNY institution, and Dr. Ray Van Dyke, our Senior Vice President, has done this work at Virginia Tech. So we have a good team here today, and we are ready to go through the refresher basics with you of Assessment 101. I wanted to point out just a couple of things before we get started. First, there are some attachments in the little attachments panel on the GoToWebinar control area. One of those is these slides so that you have them for reference or for afterwards if you'd like to have those, and also a one-sheet kind of summary of all of the tips from the webinar, so you can have that as well. So you can download those at any time. Also, the slides are a little bit text heavy. I wanted to point that out at the beginning. They're designed to also serve as a resource, so I definitely won't read every word on every slide, but that way if you have it afterwards or if you're sharing it with someone, they have everything that they need. The first thing that I'd really like to do is learn a little bit about all of you. So we're going to launch just a couple of polls. First, what best describes your assessment experience? Are you new? Are you a beginner? Are you intermediate, advanced, or expert guru level? I'll leave it open for just a little bit longer. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to respond. Awesome. You guys are fast voters. Usually this takes like a minute and we've almost got everybody. Okay. And now I want to share that with you. So we have about 10% that are brand new, 35% that are beginner, 35% that are intermediate, 19% that are advanced, and 2% that are experts. So it sounds like we're kind of all in the little bit of the beginning stages, which is great. That was the whole point of this session. So that's very helpful. Thank you. And then I have one more, just again, so we can get to know a little bit more about you. What is your role at your institution? Again, I'll leave this up, give everybody a chance to respond. So the options are faculty, staff, administrator, and other. Again, really fast voting. I love it. Thank you. Leave it up for just another moment here. Give everybody a chance. Okay. So we have 27% of you are faculty, 33% are staff, 32% administrative, and 8% others. That's a pretty even mix as well. Thank you for taking the time to do this. It always helps me kind of tailor my examples as we go through. So since this is an assessment session, we do need to have some participant outcomes. In the last dozen years or so that I've been doing these types of trainings, and Jen and Ray have done a lot of these too. Literally, we've contacted with probably hundreds of people. There are a few common challenges that we keep hearing over and over. I don't know how to do this or where to start. This takes a lot of time that I don't necessarily have, or I've done it all, but I don't use it or I don't know how to use it. And so this really helped design the focus of this webinar. We want to share some ideas for how to keep this simple, yet meaningful and manageable. So we're going to go through a very basic assessment process, starting with mission statements and ending with action plans. And I hope and assume that you will all learn at least one new thing about assessment, take away several strategies for writing effective assessment plans and reports, and also leave with at least one new idea for your program or unit. We are here as assessment professionals. This is something that we're very passionate about and interested in. We enjoy helping our colleagues at all these institutions, but each one of you is an expert in your field or your area. So we're going to be going over how to make this process a little bit easier and more valuable, but I really hope that you'll fill in the gaps with your very specific and important knowledge of your specific area. As Betsy mentioned, if you have questions as we're going through, feel free to pose those in the question panel. Jen will be kind of moderating those during, and then we'll also go over them after. There are quite a few people on the webinar today, which is awesome. So if we don't get to your question, it still keeps a record of those, and I'll be able to follow up with you. Again, this truly is designed to be for beginners or people who are kind of refreshing their assessment process. But if any of you are here as trainers, so you help people do this work at your institution or in your area, I hope that you'll be able to find some things in here that you can share with your people as well. So it will be focused not just on academic areas, but support units too. So the big questions: why do we assess? How do we assess? And when do we do it? And that last one is not just literally when during a year, but when do I do this with the other responsibilities that I have? If I'm teaching or I am an administrator or I do other things, obviously as part of my job, how do I fit this into those different jobs? So let's start with the why. There are a lot of reasons why we would do this, and there are internal and external ones, but there's advantages to both. So a lot of this does have to do with requirements for accreditation, whether that be regional or discipline specific, but I think it's also been something that has become more just a culture of assisting our students and making sure that they are leaving our program or our area or our service with what we intended. And there are a lot more supports in place at institutions to help people do this as well. So how is it the same or different from some things that we might already be doing? For example, grading. So most of you, if you're teaching, I assume that you are grading, and those can definitely be part of the story. It can't be necessarily a letter grade or sometimes even a grade on an entire project because there are other things represented there. For example, there may have been some extra credit for a course grade or even on a project grade. There could have been maybe something for perfect attendance, or maybe the project was made up of multiple pieces that were graded or assessed differently. However, getting down into those more granular levels of a grade that really are attached to outcomes, being able to write a thesis statement or something like that, drilling down to those and using those as part of your assessment is a great practice. That's definitely something you can do. So grades can be part of assessment. Grading can be part of assessment, something we're already doing that we can fold into this process so that we don't feel like we're reinventing the wheel. What about evaluation versus assessment? I know when I first started doing this kind of work, a lot of times faculty or staff would express that they felt that this was some kind of a judgment about their area. It was whether they were good or bad or doing a good or a bad job. And that's definitely not the case. That is not the point of assessment. This is more about internal quality control. Are we sharing or doing or teaching the things that are important to us, and how would we know that our students are doing that? Most of you probably have been through a program review process before. And they're similar in that a lot of the assessment information is included in program review. It's usually a component of that. But the program review itself is really addressing program health, quality, needs, costs, retention, graduation rates, faculty to student ratio. It's a very, very big picture where the assessment piece is going to be more focused on those goals and student level learning outcomes. So it's part of that, but not necessarily representative of the whole thing, but it is definitely a component. What about institutional effectiveness in assessment? Again, this is very similar to program review. Institutional effectiveness is usually a part of accreditation as well, but how is the institution achieving its mission and major goals? Sometimes the assessment of programs or even of something like general education is a part of that. And so again, those two things fit together, kind of similar to program review and assessment. And what about research and assessment? A kind of typical action research process would be plan, act, observe, and reflect. An assessment process in 4-ish steps: establish learning goals, provide learning opportunities, assess learning, and use those results to improve. So these actually look a lot alike. They're very, very similar. So I like to kind of think of assessment as a research project on your course or your program or your unit. You are trying to discover something about what you're doing and then make changes where you need to. So that's really how I like to think of assessment. All of this really boils down to your stakeholders. Typically those are students, but not always. Some of you probably serve faculty and staff. If you're a teaching and learning center, those are the people that you are trying to help and make sure that they have what they need. So all of this is really to get back to that point. What do we want to deliver? What's important for us to focus on right now? And how would we know that we're doing that? And what changes might we need to make to do it even better? So again, if we go back to thinking about those 4 steps that are kind of similar to research, the basic way to do assessment is to establish outcomes, make sure that students or stakeholders have opportunities to achieve those, to learn those things, gather information or evidence about how we would know if they're doing that, and then use that information to understand and improve our teaching or our service or whatever that might be. So it's very much like that research process. It's that research project on your unit, and this is something that of course you care deeply about. This is what you've dedicated a good part of your life to. So the first step in how we do assessment is kind of shifting our thinking to that. We want to have that shift to, this isn't something I have to do, or this isn't something that is required, although I know both of those things are also true. But if we can take a step back and think about it as, this is something I want to do because I care about my program or my unit, and I want to know how it's doing. I want it to be the very best it can be. So that's usually the first step, is just making that shift. There are a lot of different terminology sets for assessment. I wanted to actually share ours. WEAVE is an acronym for the assessment process. A lot of people don't know this. We were started at an assessment office at Virginia Commonwealth University, and they wanted to come up with an acronym that was also a word and also demonstrated how all these pieces fit together. And so this was what they came up with: write outcomes, establish criteria, assess performance against the criteria, view those results, and effect improvement through actions. So if you even want to think of, as we're going through this, that we are taking those steps, and that's what WEAVE means, that might help you just kind of remember. This one has 5 steps. Obviously, we've got that closing the loop in the back as well. But the terminology at your institution or for your accreditor might be different, and that's perfectly okay too. And then we're going to get in, okay, so that's all really great and I'm excited, but when am I supposed to do this? I teach and I'm on committees and I do these things. So let's start talking a little bit about that. How do we assess? Linda Susky, who is one of my favorite assessment gurus, has some really good guidance for us. All of this should have a point to your unit, your program, to you. It's not about program performance. It's about health and learning about what we're doing and what we hope we're doing. But if we do that, it should meet both those internal and external goals. So the ones you have set for yourself, while also meeting that requirement that the accreditor have, that this is documented. So we want to make sure that good assessment is used. It's something that you are going to come back to and use to make decisions about your area. It should also be cost effective. And I don't just mean budget wise, but if you are a 1-person office or you're the only person doing this, we have to keep that in mind. Paperwork and all of those things should be reasonable. This shouldn't be something that that makes you dreadfully tired or that you're doing late into the night. It should also begin with clear and important goals. Again, things that are very important to you. If you have a larger group that you get to work on this with, things that you really care about right now. And then yield reasonably accurate and truthful results. Again, we want to carry out an assessment that's going to give us good information that we can look at and make some decisions about, and then repeat if we can, if it works out well. Before we kind of dig into the specifics of writing the areas of an assessment plan and report, I wanted to just throw a couple of visuals up here. So from a big picture perspective, from the institution perspective, we have the institution and they are thinking about their vision. They're thinking about accreditation and state and federal requirements. Then the gen ed is also kind of up in there, your institutional learning outcomes. We get into a division and a department, and a lot of times the strategic plans are at all those levels as well. And then they are feeding down into the departments who are helping their programs do assessment, but may also have programmatic accreditation and also program review. Then we get into the courses where we're actually delivering and teaching these outcomes, or if you're a support unit like a writing center where your tutors are on the ground trying to help people do these things. And there's some assessment that usually happens in there as well, sometimes in the form of grading, sometimes in other ways. And then we get down to our stakeholder, typically a student, not always. But that's kind of the big picture of all these things that are going on, and assessment can fit in almost all of those little green areas. If we look over at the purple inverted pyramid, these are the pieces that I'm going to go over with you today. So kind of similar to the institution, your unit probably has a vision that fed into a mission. You may or may not have some broad goals, and then get into your outcomes and objectives, which may relate to the strategic plan or general education or programmatic accreditation at your institution or for your program. Then we get into how will I know if my students, how will I find out if they know these things? How can I measure that? Well, what would it look like? If they've learned it, how will I know? And then how can I share that in the form of findings so that I can help inform everything in that lighter shaded inverted pyramid? How can I do that? And then make it a loop so that I go back and make changes that are appropriate, whether that be curriculum or services or those types of things for the next year. And then of course there's kind of program review where this is part of that. So I wanted to kind of put those up here. This is kind of our agenda for the rest of the session. We're going to go through each of those items on that purple inverted pyramid, and I'll give you some tips on how to make these meaningful but also really manageable. So let's start at the beginning with a mission statement. A mission statement for your unit should be specific. It should state your purpose. It should align with any parent entities, so if it's your institution or your department, and it should also make clear your unit's functions and for who you do those things, so your stakeholders. This is a little bit more specific here, what you would want to put in. There's a lot of different ways that you can write these, but I always tell people it doesn't have to be a novel or even a chapter. It can be a few sentences. It can be 2 to 4 sentences. And for the purposes of what we're talking about here today, that's completely okay. And also, even though sometimes it's hard to edit it down to be that small, it should feel less cumbersome or less challenging if you know you don't have to write a really long mission statement. If it's specific and it lists out who you do your work for and your why you do those things, and it aligns with other parent units, then you have written a good mission statement. So I'm going to share an example here. University Career Services, an integral part of the educational process, assists students and alumni in assessing their career possibilities, setting their personal goals, and achieving their objectives towards becoming productive citizens in the global community. While assisting its clients in identifying professional employment opportunities, University Career Center Services also provides the university community with insights into the ever-changing world of work to help develop realistic ways to better educate tomorrow's leaders. So this is, again, it's 2 long sentences, and let's say that it's around 4 sentences, but it says who, they both serve students, and they help with the faculty and staff on campus by informing them about what's going on with hiring, how they link to the institution and then to the larger community. And again, it's not very long. So this is a good example of a pretty concise mission statement. Next, we move into goals. Not everybody uses goals, but when they are used, it's a link between the mission and then the more specific learning outcomes. So they're very broad. They're more about the destination than the path. Couple of examples here. Sometimes units will use parent unit's items to associate with, or if you have an accreditor, sometimes these are set for you by your programmatic accreditor. Again, some units choose not to use them at all, and that's perfectly okay. But if you look at the examples here, these are pretty broad. There's something that we would have some difficulty really specifically measuring because they are so broad, but that's okay. That's the point of goals. So it's kind of a bridge between the mission and your more specific outcomes. When we get into outcomes, this is when the terminology regarding these starts to vary quite a bit between accrediting bodies, different regions, states, or even institutions, and even inside of an institution, people might use different terminology for what an outcome is. But generally, it's something that's very specific, a task or a point to be reached, in our case, typically by a stakeholder. There's a criteria here that's kind of helpful when you're thinking about writing these. They need to be specific, measurable, and verifiable, agreed upon, realistic yet rigorous, and time-bound. So whereas a goal does not necessarily have an endpoint, most outcomes will. By the end of a program, end of a course, end of an experience is something that we would expect stakeholders or students to be able to know or do. So you can kind of set those up depending on what type of a unit that you are. Using action verbs is the best way to make sure you're writing out a good outcome. Objectives, which is a slightly different term for kind of the same thing, these detail aspects or tasks that we're going to complete. So usually, again, they still have action words, but it's something about raising money or increasing something. So they're still specific, very measurable, but they don't always focus on stakeholders. It's usually more of an end result of something. So just a summary screen here, kind of showing the difference between the goals and the outcomes. One is general, one is specific, one is longer term, the other is shorter term. Goals cannot be measured. Objectives and outcomes need to be measured. Goals indicate where we want to go, and outcomes are the steps to getting there. So I have an example up here as well. Students will learn conversational Spanish versus students will use 50 vocabulary words in conversation with another student. There are two basic types of learning outcomes. There's learning and programmatic. All entities could have both. But if you're working with learning outcomes, these will be the knowledge, skills, or attitudes or habits of mind that your students or stakeholders will take with them. Again, you could still have learning outcomes if you are the teaching and learning center or even the library, something like that. Any of those could still have learning outcomes. So this is something that we want them to demonstrate, know, or do by the end of something, an experience, a course, etc. When you are getting ready to brainstorm these, I like to think of this as kind of again, a writing project. And I used to teach freshman composition and literature and tech writing. And I found that lots of students had trouble getting started. And lots of us struggle with that. So I like to approach it that way, where when you're brainstorming, nothing is a bad idea, right? You can come up with as many outcomes as you want to. Get all of them out on paper, type them, however that works best for you. Things that you can think about, competencies related to your area or your programmatic accreditation, skills, attitudes, expectations of your graduates, performance, or some way that they can show you an ability. Application, you can use some of that Bloom's taxonomy terms, cognition or knowledge, and then think about how will you know that the students have learned this? What does it look like? How would you identify it? And again, using those action verbs will help. Same program outcomes, I still suggest the same brainstorming strategies, but these might be more process statements. Academic units can also have program outcomes. Maybe you feel like your area, you really want to work on advising. You need to redo how the students are advised. That would be a program outcome. So you don't have to necessarily have all of one or all of the other. You can mix them up regardless of your unit type. But these could be process statements related to what you want to accomplish, volume of activity, satisfaction statements. If you're a unit that, I always like to use the parking services on campus. They do surveys and try and figure out how they can best help people and make sure everybody can get to where they need to go. Those would be some examples of program outcomes. Here are some areas to help you kind of brainstorm for those. So it could be access, facilities, staff or faculty, technology, and you can think about questions. What are the most important results or impacts that should occur as part of your entity's activities? What's your critical work? And then what do you want your user to experience through interaction with your unit? When you get ready to write these, after you've brainstormed, what I usually recommend people do is pick your very favorite 3 to 5. So they can change every year. Some units, they assess them for 3 years. There's lots of different ways that that can get done. But what we definitely don't want is you assessing an outcome that isn't important to you or to your team, or an outcome that isn't part of your curriculum or something like that. So keeping it linked to that mission, but something that's important to you and to your group. Keep them limited in number. Again, 3 to 5 is usually good to start. If any of you have programmatic accreditation, I realize that sometimes that's not allowed. Sometimes you have 13 and that's just what you have to do. But again, those are important, so that's a good thing. Make sure that they're measurable, and again, use those action words. Here are some examples of outcomes. So this is, again, a place where a lot of times if we're just beginning this, we sometimes feel a little bit stuck. So if there's lots of good tips in here, but there was another resource I really wanted to share with you. It's something called the Assessment Commons. It's just assessmentcommons.org. And I clicked on the view full resources area here. You do have to put in an email address. I think that's just for kind of the site security, making sure that there's no bots and things like that on here. But this is an awesome resource. There are assessment handbooks in here and general resources, and you can even go through and search for your type of unit. So if you were a writing center and you wanted to come up with some outcomes, but you were stuck, you could go here and there would probably be some examples from other writing centers that they had shared. If you're in physics, same thing. If you are in student affairs, this page has amazing resources for that. You do not have to reinvent the wheel when you're doing this work. If you want to start from scratch, of course, that's completely okay. But what I have found in this assessment community is that people are more than willing to share. They're happy to do it. Nobody wants you to make the same stumbles that they may have made. So people love sharing this work. So this is a good resource. The Assess listserv, another wonderful resource. And then if you Google things, a lot of times there are people who've put theirs out there also to share. So you don't have to start from scratch when you're brainstorming. You can absolutely access some of these areas to brainstorm outcomes, see how people are measuring things. It's a really good way to generate some ideas. And I did list some examples on this screen as well. And then I put the link to that resource in the footer. So if you have the slide, you'll be able to just open it right up. Next, we get into our measures, and I think that this is probably the area that people who are new to this struggle with the most. We want reliable information, but this is also not a dissertation. So while it needs to be accurate, if you're going to be making decisions for your program based on it, it is not a dissertation. It's not a book. This is iterative. You can change it as you need to. It can be very agile. So keep that in mind as you're doing this. When you're getting ready to decide these, you want to look for sources of evidence. Where could you find information about these outcomes? How would you get that? Are you going to embed some common questions again, across maybe some course exams? Are you going to pull out a sample of student papers from a set of courses and apply a rubric to those? Do you have some of these things already in place that you could already do these things? Kind of some history on measures. I always like to show this slide and have people kind of read over it and then pose the question, which column do you think would yield more reliable, interesting, and actionable information, the traditional or the contemporary? And the contemporary is typically what people say because it's a much more specific, it's aligned with things that are important that we want our students to learn. And there's been a lot of research in the last 20 or 30 years about how to do this well while we're still grading and collecting other information. Brainstorming measures. This is just a very simple chart, an example for course or program assessment, where we have our outcomes down one side and then possible projects in courses or across a program where those outcomes might be happening. So this would just be a way to start brainstorming. Okay, we want to have an outcome about writing effective thesis statements. Which projects definitely have those? Or proper documentation. Which projects are research projects? Where can we pull samples? So this is a nice grid to kind of visually decide where you might be able to get some information. You can also then use a project sometimes for more than one of your outcomes, which will help make it more efficient, and you won't be trying to create brand new measures when you already have a great one that's in place. So if you can use things that are already being done, it'll make this a lot more manageable. This map is from Weave, and it's quite a bit more specific. This is for a bachelor's degree program. And here what we've done is we have the courses down the side and the outcomes across the top. And then inside each cell, we have different types of assignments that the students might be completing. And we can fill in the grid that way. So here we can see exactly what they're doing and where we might be able to draw some assessment measures, get some information about those outcomes. Here's another example. This is from an administrative unit, a career center, and they took it one step further. This is actually from a real school where they put in their courses. These are the experiences that their stakeholders have with them. So they have consulting, they have common activities, they have collaborations, they have resources on a page, on a website. And then they said, which of these touch points or courses touch our stakeholders and our outcomes, and when do we collect that information? So they made an actual time-bound plan. We're going to collect this information in May. We're going to collect this information every week. So this was a way for them to make a plan in a very visual format where they could keep track of what they were going to do for their assessment. Here's another example of a map that you could make. It's just a table, it's just a grid, but it's very similar to that one that I just showed you, where you could say, where is this delivered, in what way, and how can I gather that information? When will I do it? You could even say who might be responsible for that. So I found that people really like these tables for brainstorming. It's really, really helpful for them. So the 3 M's of an effective measure: make sure it's observable, that you can observe it, count it, quantify it, that it's meaningful, that it relates to your outcome, and that it's manageable, that it doesn't have to be something that's going to cause you great angst. I have a good example of this. When I was at A&M, I was working with an amazing advising group, and they really got excited about this and wanted to do some amazing things. And they wanted to create a little form that after every advising session that the advisor would quickly fill out. And it was going to help them tackle some of their outcomes. But at an institution of that size, and with the number of advising sessions that they do, we were talking literally thousands of pieces of paper. And what I didn't want was for them to run into that and then not use it at all because it was too overwhelming, or stop halfway through, something like that. I wanted it to feel approachable. So we talked about several examples. We talked about maybe doing it on every 5th one, or only on a certain, maybe a 2-week period, something like that. What they ended up doing is they said, no, we're going to go ahead and do it on all of them, but then we're going to pull out a sample. We're going to analyze a sample of those forms. You could do this same thing with writing assignments, things like that with students. So make sure that it is manageable. Again, this is not for publication. This is just for you to examine your program health. So it's okay to take samples like that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about direct and indirect measures. So there are 2 basic types. Directs are just like what they would sound like. They are countable, observable. They're usually a number, or we can show a trend. And rubrics are a good example. Pre-post tests, portfolios with a rubric, those types of things. Indirect measures are a stakeholder's perception of something, whether it be their level of learning, their opinion, their satisfaction, or their opinion of the benefit. So surveys, exit interviews, focus groups, those types of things. Both are good, and we actually typically see people use both together. So when you're getting ready to write these, they do offer complementary information, but make sure you always have some direct measures. That's going to give you more actionable information, but still be realistic so that it is not a burden to do all of that collection. Next, we get into achievement targets. So we have our mission, we've selected our 3 to 5 outcomes. We have designed at least one direct, hopefully a direct and an indirect measure for each of our outcomes. And now we're looking at achievement targets. Not everyone uses these, but they're really helpful to help you set goals and know what success would look like for you. So if you hope that your students would achieve a certain score on a rubric, that would be your target. People struggle with setting these because they're not sure if they should make it 100% or 50%. They don't, we all kind of seem to worry about what everyone else is going to think about our targets. You know best. You know what success would look like. So you have complete autonomy to set your targets. If you are in an area like nursing or something like that, there may be pass rates that you will use for some of those examinations that your students take. Those are great examples of targets, and they're typically not 100%. Sometimes the pass rates on those exams are 50%, and that's okay. If you are, if you really want to set something at 100%, then that's great. You can do that. And if you don't meet that target, that's okay. You can adjust it the next year, or you can look at why and decide if you want to change it or not. So here's some examples of target statements. They're very specific. They typically name a number that you're looking for or a trend. We want to see increased participation, something like that. So putting it all together. Here I've given some examples in this table. So if you look at each column, that would be the outcome, the measure, the target, the measure, the target. So we have a learning outcome and a couple of program outcomes here. But this is how it fits together. These are pretty truncated. I'm kind of a fan of brevity, even though I have a background in English. You can always make these longer if you want to, but I just want to show you that it can fit into a table if you want it to. You don't have to write a whole bunch if that's not something that you feel like works for you. In Weave, it looks like this. I always get this question when I do these sessions. Well, what does it look like in Weave? So we have our outcome, and then we can align with some other initiatives. That's for another conversation. Then we have our assessment methods. This one happens to be a capstone project. And then we have a target down below. So all of those things can be entered in a table, in a system. You can use whatever works best for you. Word document, completely up to you. Again, these slides are a little text heavy because I want them to be a resource for you after the fact, but a couple of tips. Focus on the end result of the learning and not the experience. That will make sure that you can measure it. Make sure that you find a measurable manifestation of the outcome, that you know where to look so that you can get that information. And I usually caution people not to use the word "and" in their outcomes or their measures, because if it's using "and," it's probably two separate outcomes or two separate measures. It's okay to go ahead and break those out. Also, make sure you don't mix up any of the other pieces. So your achievement target, your outcome, and your measure should all be separate. That way, when you go to write and fill in the findings, and when you turn in the report, it will be really, really clear to people what goes with what. And that's the same thing here, just making sure that you're not mixing those up. Again, I know that was a little fast, but you have the slides if you want to keep those. That way you'll have those examples to read for later. Findings or results equal the assessment data. When you gathered all that information, what did you find out? Again, this is not because we're under a microscope or that we're being judged or evaluated in any way. This is part of our research project. Can our students really write thesis statements? Can our students really demonstrate that they have this knowledge in the field, whatever it might be? The process or the action of assessment, it does have to be documented for accreditation and other purposes, but really this findings piece and the next part is for that internal use, that research project on our unit that we talked about at the very beginning. What do I want to know about this, and what am I going to do with that information? Finding statements can be very straightforward. Again, sometimes this varies depending on your accrediting body. If you're, I keep thinking of engineering, they have some very specific tables that they often have to provide. But if you're a unit that doesn't have that, you really can just write a very basic sentence about what you found out. So here I have the target in one column and the finding in the other. And you can see that the language parallels the target, but it's very, very simple and straightforward. I'm just listing what I discovered. After I've done that, and this is a very important step, you've probably heard closing the loop. This is where we want to analyze our findings. If we just stop at collecting the information, then we won't make those important changes that we might need to our program. And I also like to point out that there might be some really great stuff that you want to celebrate. Maybe you did meet your targets and you're a little surprised. That's great. Maybe you learned something else that your students can do that you didn't realize. Feel free to share those celebrations as well. Assessment is not just about constant change. It's also about celebrating what's going really well. So what did you find out? What are you excited about? What are you celebrating? But what else could you change if you need to? Do you need to address some different outcomes? Do you need to change curriculum? Those types of things. If you do want to do that, then you can create an action plan. And these look differently depending on the unit, but you can decide if there's something you need to do. Do you need to get some new technology? Do you need to provide some support for your student or stakeholders? Do you need to make some hires? Do you need to change the curriculum? Do you need to change the assessment process? There will be some of those questions that happen, and if you make the action plan right when you're thinking about it and start mobilizing it, then you'll be able to make those changes for the next year. Typically what people do is they do their mission, outcomes, measures, and targets in the fall. So right around now, they'll go all the way up to targets, have that plan in place. Then they'll collect information through whatever time period it is, typically it's May, and then they'll do the findings and the action plan, take a summer break, putting quotes around that, and then you come back in the fall ready to work on your action plan. And if your assessment process went well, you just collect the same information again. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every year either. It just depends on what you want to do. Some people will also assess the assessment. This could be self or peer reviewed. There's lots of great rubrics out there to help with this. So if you want to really think about, well, do I need to revise my outcomes? Are there other stakeholders that might want to be part of this process and help me with it? Some schools are actually involving students in this, which I think is really cool. Getting their opinion, like, well, how would you structure this if you were trying to decide if you had learned this or not? They have great ideas. So that's another step that you can take if you want to. Other reflective possibilities. So as we pointed out when I had those inverted pyramids, this assessment work applies in a lot of areas. You can use it to demonstrate how you're contributing to the institution. Gen Ed, strategic planning, mission and vision items. You can highlight great things that have happened in your program during the year. It might cause you to also think about events that you've had, community service, teaching activities of your faculty, or challenges that you're having. You know, we don't have enough classroom space. Our faculty to student ratio is not where we want it to be. Those types of things can all funnel out of assessment. So you can use this to do things like ask for money. When you're doing your budget requests, you'll already have the data to say, we need this, we studied it, and we need this resource, and that's why we're requesting it. And this is how much we are requesting to get this done. So that assessment can actually literally help you get those funds or those initiatives started if you need to do that. Other things you can assess, grants, if you need to do this for accreditation, if you want to do your own self-assessment, or if you have faculty and staff that do professional development assessment, courses, strategic planning, all of those types of things that we saw in those inverted pyramids can be part of this. So all of this really does fit together. It all comes back to also having this be a collaborative experience for our campus community, which includes our students. There's a lot of ways that we can involve them, we can work together. One of my favorite things in doing this work is seeing when people from different units will collaborate on a gen ed assessment or a survey that's going to go to different groups of students, but they all get some information out of it. You'd be surprised how many people on your campus are doing this work already and will be happy to share some measures with you so that you're working together, getting great information, and again, not losing sleep over how you're going to get this done. This is the too long didn't read slide. So if you've been waiting for this one, these are the most important things I would want to share with you. Start and end with genuine aspirations. Make sure that it's something that matters to you. Otherwise, at the end, it won't really make any difference. Make sure that it's used, cost-effective, accurate, and meaningful. And don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. If you can use or modify something you are already doing, that is completely okay and absolutely the idea. Keep the process manageable. You don't have to assess every single thing every year. If you have a program with 5 students, you probably could assess a lot of the work that they do. There's only 5 of them. If you have 500 students in your program, you're going to need to do some sampling and do some other ways of getting that information, working with your faculty, embedded assessments, those types of things. But don't feel like it has to be something that it shouldn't hurt, is what I'm trying to say. Be deliberate when you're writing, keeping those areas separate. It'll save you time later when you're getting ready to turn in a report and use it for multiple purposes. Be realistic, prioritize, and ask for resources where you can if you need them. Close the loop. Make sure that you are taking that information back to the beginning. Does this still align with our mission? Are these the outcomes we want? How can we make this better? And be flexible. You'll make changes along the way. That's completely the idea. That's totally okay and makes it better. It really does. I do have a reference slide in here. And then I want to open up our question area and see what kinds of questions we're getting. And I desperately need a drink of water, so I'm going to let Jen and Ray help me with this as well. And hopefully you guys can see these. I always think it's really helpful to actually be able to read the question. So let's take the first one. What is the difference between program outcomes and program goals? So the goals are typically much more broad. We want to have competent graduates. That would be really difficult to measure. It's kind of big. A program outcome would be much more specific. Our graduates should have this kind of knowledge of their field, and usually it would be more specific even than that. Because I have an English background, our students should be able to write effective thesis statements. That's really, really specific. A competent student should be able to do that, but I can measure with a rubric if they can write competent thesis statements. Second question, if it's my first time collecting data on a measure, how should I set my target? I love this question. I think, and I would love for Ray and Jen to chime in if they have a different opinion, that it's perfectly okay to say, I'm setting a benchmark. This is the first time we've done this. I worked with a group a couple of weeks ago that they were a brand new program, brand new. And that was his question. How do I know, okay, I can find the outcomes and the measures, but what do I put for the targets? We've never done this before. I think it's okay to say we're getting, this is our year to get benchmarks. So our target is set benchmark. And I think that that's perfectly okay for your first year.
Yeah, that's exactly what I advise folks too. This is Jennifer. If you don't have a benchmark yet, or if you're not quite sure what your threshold is, your target, you just write in that target box, we are collecting a target this year. Mm-hmm. We're researching our target. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and it also, I think, makes for good conversation within the faculty of, so what do we think we would like the target to be? What would we feel good about if it's, 75% of our students have achieved this versus 60% versus 95%? And then, of course, you also have this notion of, are you going to, in the beginning, be aspirational and think about this is really what, at some point in the future, I would like it to be. But, we more than likely, we won't get to that point the first year, but it's something that we would like to be striving for or aspiring to.
These are good questions. I'll go to the third one. Can you talk more about using capstone projects as measures? A lot of people handle this differently, but I know a lot of us like that capstone because it's that end of experience. It's when that culminating curriculum and all of those different things have brought them to where they are, and we hope that they've learned a set of outcomes for a program. There's lots of different ways to do this, but what I think I've seen most often, and I'd love to hear what Ray and Jen think, is, again, if it's a small program, you might go ahead and assess all of them with a rubric. There's a lot of great rubrics out there. AAC&U has some wonderful ones on some pretty generally accepted important types of skills like writing, critical thinking, those types of things. But again, using that assessment resource I shared or other colleagues that you have, taking either all if you're a small program or a sample of your capstone projects and applying that rubric and setting some targets based around that. So if there's components to the capstone project, appropriate research, maybe critical thinking, maybe some stuff about writing. Is it readable? Is it organized? Is there some kind of original research that has to be in there? You can definitely make your own rubric and apply it to that and use that as a measure.
Yeah, and I think you know, the way different programs have gone about doing that kind of goes back to some of the things that Amber was saying about making this process kind of dependent on the resources that you have. And you know, we'd love to do some really amazing things, but we only have so many resources, both with people and with finances. But again, kind of going on with what Amber said, and you know, as I'm thinking back about my experiences on campus, one program essentially pulled a sample of those capstone projects and then paid faculty a small stipend to come in after spring semester was over, spent half a day kind of making sure that they had inter-rater reliability by looking at a few of those and rating them, and then talking about why did you rate it a 3, a 2, or a 1. And then the next day and a half, they actually went in and did the ratings, you know, 1, 2, 3, whatever it might be, based on this rubric. And of course, a lot of discussion about the rubric, and was the rubric, did the rubric really match what they were looking for in that outcome? And then finally, great discussions over, you know, what the ratings were and what different people were seeing. So it's a really good faculty development kind of exercise, as well as getting the data back that lets you know how successful you were.
Thank you, Ray. That was a really good specific explanation of that. I always loved those sessions where I kind of helped with the norming, and the faculty usually did too. It ended up being kind of fun, if it's okay to use that word when we talk about this work. Question 4, what's the difference between writing outcomes versus measures versus targets? So your outcome is what you want your student or stakeholder to be able to know or do or demonstrate. The measure is how you will find out if they're doing that. So it might be a paper, it might be an exam, any other way that you would be able to see or know that they had demonstrated that outcome, that ability. And then the target is, what's the benchmark for that? Would you want 80% of your students to show that they could do that, 100%? So those are the difference between those three. Question 5, do you have any resources that point to examples of non-academic assessment outcomes in support and student affairs? I do. We actually have a wonderful webinar about this in our resource center. So if you go to weaveeducation.com and click on resources, it's about halfway down the page. There's a student affairs webinar. So that's really good. And that resource page that I had pulled up earlier also has an entire section dedicated to student affairs. And there's also one on administrative unit assessment. There's a lot of really wonderful examples on both of those areas. Number 6, do we need to devise an action plan on just 1 year, or should we wait and collect a few years of data before making changes? If so, what do we do during the interim? That's a really good question. I would say it probably depends on what you are planning to do. So for something like curriculum changes, I know that those they're obviously very important, and they require usually feedback from a large group. So you might want to have more data before proposing that kind of a change, but you could create an action plan on gathering that data to know if you need to make the change. Sometimes the action plan is collect more information on this. Not that we all want more assessment work, but with something like curriculum that's really important, I think it's okay to have that be an ongoing action plan to inform that group about the changes that need to be made. I'd love to hear if Jennifer or Ray has another response for that question.
I think you're absolutely right that it depends on how big the changes that you're trying to make, or that you're not sure if you need to make it. If it's something really significant, you're going to want multiple years worth of data to show, especially if you're going to be requesting funding for that. You're going to want to have significant data to show that you're in need of something, you know, that important. Whereas if it's something more simple, smaller, 1 year is probably plenty. Yeah, I think based on the measure, you'll know.
These are good questions.
I know that answer of "it depends" is terrible.
I know. And this is another, we mentioned that assess listserv before, and there are others. People will throw these questions to that large group and get some really great feedback and ideas. That is has always been one of my favorite listservs to read. Just such a wonderful community about helping with those things. Number 7, do you have an example of how you've returned reluctant faculty on to the action research aspect of assessment? I do, and it does require some time. I think most of us here at Weave have also been faculty, either full-time or adjunct faculty, so we've been on both sides of this, and we understand the pressures of teaching and research and those types of things. So I know what I appreciated as a faculty member, and what I found to be appreciated when I was on this side of it was to make the time if I'm the IE director or what have you, to make the time to provide workshops or one-on-one meetings where we sit down and say, I really want to tell me about your program. I want to know about what's important to you in your program. What do your students do? What are they good at? What do you think they're not good at? What do you wish that they did more of? And then use that beautiful conversation as a starting point for making that assessment plan, in some cases with them. And again, I know that that is time consuming. There's no way around that, but we have another wonderful person that we work with, Tisha Paredes at ODU, and she has this wonderful kind of process. She calls it Friends of Assessment, and she goes to people's offices and does this with them, invests her time in listening and helping them write their initial plan, and then they become her friend of assessment, and then they go out to their colleagues and do the same thing. But really letting somebody talk about what they're interested in and turning that into the assessment plan, it makes people feel that they're being heard, and then it turns into a document that they can then actually use. If they don't use this stuff, they're not going to want to do it. We're all that way. Our students don't like busy work, right? We don't want this to feel like busy work. So I think taking that time to sit with them and listen and really help them craft something that they end up being happy with is one of the best ways to do that. And it is time intensive, but it'll pay dividends. You only have to really do that once, and then that will have transformed, hopefully, that person's experience with assessment. Number 8, how can I start a conversation with my supervisor whose assessments exist but are not aligned with the outcomes? I really like the tables that I had in the presentation. Some people call them maps, grids, tables. That very visual way of kind of boiling it down to very few words, and then literally having to look at a grid and say, why is this in this column? These two things don't match. That's, in my opinion, I think that's a really good way to have that conversation, because it's really, really visual. And you can then also make some changes and move some stuff around so that it all lines up. I hope that helps with that question, though. Go ahead, Ray.
Sorry, Amber. Yeah, and just to add to that, and numerous times in my experience, I've had these conversations with faculty who have set learning outcomes and believe, as they're meeting and talking and having these wonderful discussions, which, by the way, are a wonderful kind of side benefit of doing this work, that faculty actually sit down and talk about teaching and learning and what they want their students to know. And so it ends up then that after those conversations, and they say, okay, here are the enduring understandings. These are the things that anyone who graduates with a bachelor's degree in this area should have. Then as they get to that point, then they begin saying, okay, we really believe this. Now, where do we teach those things? Mm-hmm. And they begin doing the mapping or the review of the curriculum, and occasionally, at least, find, hey, wait, we say this is a learning outcome everyone with a bachelor's degree in this subject should have, but we're really, there is this possibility that a student could get through our program and not take a course that addresses that particular outcome. Mm-hmm. So that's my my one example of that.
That's a good one too. Thanks, Ray. Number 9, for SACs, is it required to have program outcomes in addition to student learning outcomes? Can you explain the difference? Ray is kind of our resident SACs expert, so I'm going to ask him to answer this one. if he doesn't mind.
Yeah, I think it's actually a statement that it is required to have program
Okay,
outcomes.
not
So
a question. Got it.
Yeah, so what's the difference? So the student learning outcomes are those outcomes that are directly related to when a student graduates from our university with this degree, they should have these skills, abilities, attitudes, however you end up defining exactly what a learning outcome is. Often the program outcomes are more in line with that we have a certain amount of research taking place, or that we have our faculty to student ratio has improved from a certain point. And Amber, I think you maybe covered some others of those that you and Jen could add. But yeah, the learning outcomes are specifically related to what the student will learn. The program outcomes are more of what you want for the unit to achieve.
It might be ranking for your program. It could be, again, something around advising or another type of service that you provide. Things that might benefit the students, but aren't something that they directly learn or do. And that last one is really good too, but we're gonna answer this one, and then we have just one more thing we're going to do, and then we will wrap it up. Can you use the results from a standardized test to say whether or not a particular program is effective, while also using that same standardized test to measure student learning outcomes? If so, what would be the difference in the way the outcome would be worded? I think this happens a lot with certain disciplines where they do have certain tests that are indicating, or they may even be required, students have to score a certain number in order to pass the test and become whatever it might be. So I think it's okay. A lot of those also relate to programmatic accreditation. So in those instances, I think it is perfectly okay to use those together. You shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel just to do your assessment plan if you're already doing that good work for your accreditor. Ray and Jen, would you kind of say the same thing? I know you, Jen, specifically have kind of worked with some of our more technical programs, in our solutions, and I think that we see a lot of this in there where they just use the standardized tests and the accreditor language as part of the assessment process as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think I would hesitate to have a standardized test used as a measure of whether or not an entire program is effective. I would definitely recommend using it just for a student learning outcome, and I wouldn't even use the entire test. I would recommend pulling out the specific questions only that have to do with that outcome, right? So maybe there's only 3 or 4 questions on that exam that refer to that outcome. Maybe you have another outcome with another subject area that uses other questions. So over the course of all of your outcomes, you could use that entire exam. But I don't think I would use it to measure the entire program, just that one exam.
Yeah, that's too broad, but to break it out, that's a good way to describe it. Okay, I'm going to go back to my presentation here for a moment. I do want to thank you all for coming, and if we didn't get to your question, there were a lot of you on the call today. We still get those from the GoToMeeting, so I will go through those and answer your questions. So if you sent one that didn't come through, don't worry. And we really appreciate you coming. We'd love it if you take the survey. We use that to create more resources. Honestly, that's what we're trying to do. So we also want to know what you liked, what was helpful, what you wanted to know more about. There's lots more webinars and resources in our resource center, weaveeducation.com, and you go to the resource tab. And now I want to let Betsy kind of wrap up for us.
Thank you, Amber, and thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. Here at Weave, we're committed to helping institutions improve student learning, and as many of you know, we do that by providing intuitive and cost-effective software. If you need help in the areas of assessment, accreditation, credentials management, strategic planning, and program review, we really should talk. There are a lot of reasons to choose Weave. It's a single, powerful, easy-to-use system for internal and external evaluation of programs and people. It's in the cloud, so there's no infrastructure needed and very little involvement from your IT staff. And when you choose Weave, you choose a team of colleagues who will be with you every step of the way with a single focus to help you get better. If you would like a demonstration of Weave, please visit weaveeducation.com and click Request a Demo. And while you're there, don't forget to check out the other webinars available on demand on our resource page. Thanks again for your time, and I hope everyone has a great day.